In 1976, a young Emirati prince graduated from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, sealing a decades-long pipeline of absolute trust between the ruling elite of the Persian Gulf and the British establishment. In 2026, that same prince, now the President of the United Arab Emirates, oversaw an administrative maneuver that effectively designated the entire higher education system of Great Britain as an active ideological hazard. A single document, published quietly on a ministry server in Abu Dhabi, severed a multi-billion-pound educational axis that had sustained British institutional prestige for generations. The global economy of soft power has inverted. One of America's closest Arab allies has looked at the heart of Western academia and concluded that something has gone fundamentally wrong. To understand how this architecture collapsed, one must examine the structural mechanics that held it together. British higher education operates on a profound, state-enforced financial deficit. Between 2012 and 2025, domestic undergraduate tuition fees remained frozen while relentless inflation eroded their real-world value by 27%. By the 2024-2025 financial year, 43% of English universities were forecasting outright deficits, hemorrhaging cash from their core operations. To prevent systemic bankruptcy, the university sector engineered a replacement mechanism, the high-fee international student. The Gulf states became the primary underwriters of this financial survival strategy. By 2024, the volume of Emirati students on British campuses had doubled within 7 years, climbing to approximately 8,100 individuals. The UAE government directly absorbed the entire invoice, issuing generous federal scholarships that covered premium tuition, housing, international travel, and private health insurance. This was not a standard commercial exchange. It was an arrangement where Britain exported academic credentials and political influence, while the Gulf imported Western-aligned administrative capacity for its future ministries, boardrooms, and embassies. But a system built purely on balancing university ledgers develops critical blind spots. While London viewed these student flows as a reliable source of liquid capital, Abu Dhabi monitored the destination through a strict national security apparatus. In November 2014, the UAE officially designated the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, placing it under the same aggressive counter-terrorism laws applied to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. For the Emirati state, the Brotherhood's core doctrine that society must be governed by political Islam represents an existential threat to the constitutional legitimacy of Gulf monarchies. London chose an entirely different regulatory path. A 2015 internal review commissioned by the British government and led by Sir John Jenkins concluded that aspects of the Brotherhood's tactics were openly contrary to British national security interests. Yet, the political establishment chose not to ban the organization. For 15 years, across multiple changes of government, British policymakers maintained that the group remained under close review. While the political review remained static, the physical environment inside British lecture halls transformed. Internal regulatory registries began recording a sharp acceleration in radicalization indicators. In the 2023-2024 academic year, 70 students across British universities were flagged for formal referral to Prevent, the UK's flagship counter-radicalisation programme, due to concerns over Islamist extremism. Simultaneously, the Office for Students reported that total cases escalated to specialised Prevent officers reached 265, marked by a 75% surge in Islamist-linked cases within a single 12-month cycle. The breakdown was not merely statistical, it was behavioural. Academic staff, quoted in industry publications, confessed to an atmosphere of pervasive intimidation. Lecturers openly stated they were terrified to challenge extremist rhetoric or report radicalization signs due to fear of immediate administrative penalties or social reprisal from specific student demographics. The internal containment mechanisms of British liberalism had paralyzed themselves. The UAE operates with an advantage Western states do not possess: a closed return pipeline. Every state-sponsored student eventually returns to the Gulf to take up positions within the civil service or state industries. By late 2024, internal security screenings of returning graduates began triggering red flags within the Emirati intelligence network. The arithmetic for Abu Dhabi became undeniable. The state was directly subsidizing the exposure of its future leadership class to the very political ideology it had spent billions of dollars trying to neutralize globally. The structural decoupling began silently, registering first not in diplomatic cables, but in the UK Home Office visa databases. In the year ending September 2025, the number of British study visas granted to Emirati citizens plummeted to just 213. This represented an immediate 27% drop year on year, and a brutal 55% collapse from the figures recorded in 2022. This quiet withdrawal occurred against a backdrop of deep structural friction. For 2 years, the broader UK-UAE relationship had been absorbing severe diplomatic bruises. In late 2023, an Abu Dhabi-backed consortium attempted a £600 million acquisition of the Daily Telegraph. The British government blocked the transaction on national security grounds, provoking severe frustration in Abu Dhabi. Concurrently, Manchester City, owned by a senior member of the Abu Dhabi royal family, was subjected to unprecedented financial regulations and legal charges by the Premier League. In Parliament, British lawmakers openly accused the UAE of backing paramilitary atrocities in the Sudanese civil war. The Education Alliance was already freezing. The final trap snapped in June 2025. The UAE Ministry of Higher Education published a routine Arabic language administrative update detailing the foreign institutions officially recognized for state scholarships. The criteria appeared standard. A university had to rank within the global top 200 outside America and Australia. Great Britain possessed 64 higher education institutions that easily met this standard. Yet, when the registry was uploaded, institutions from France, Europe, and even Israel were meticulously listed. Every single British university, including Oxford, Cambridge, the London School of Economics, and Imperial College, had been systematically erased. For months, Whitehall officials remained in a state of absolute strategic confusion, uncertain if the omission was an administrative error or a deliberate geopolitical strike. The silence held until early 2026, when the international financial press finally pierced the diplomatic veil. A person directly involved in the Abu Dhabi decision stripped away the bureaucratic pretense, summarizing the structural collapse in a single line that rerouted the geopolitical landscape of European education. They don't want their kids to be radicalized on campus. The machinery of Western soft power had formally transformed into a vector of national security contagion. The erasure of British universities from the Abu Dhabi Scholarship Registry did not merely signal a diplomatic freeze. It triggered a violent structural feedback loop inside an already unstable financial ecosystem. The modern British university operates like an international corporation with immense fixed overheads, dependent entirely on high-margin foreign tuition to subsidize loss-making domestic operations. When the Gulf pipeline contracted, the immediate cash deficit tore through the balance sheets of 24 elite Russell Group institutions. The precision of the financial math explains the speed of this decay. A domestic undergraduate represents a net loss of approximately £4,000 per year to an English university. A premium international student yields a net profit of up to £25,000. The sudden drop in affluent Middle Eastern enrollment did not simply reduce profits, it removed the structural masonry holding up the entire academic enterprise. To plug this accelerating black hole, university boards implemented a desperate, counterproductive stabilization strategy. They systematically lowered entry thresholds. Throughout late 2024 and 2025, institutions quietly reduced English language proficiency requirements and bypassed traditional grade criteria to capture alternative international markets, primarily across South Asia and West Africa. This volume-heavy recruitment drive temporarily stabilized cash flows, but immediately destabilized the social fabric of the campuses. Lecture halls filled with students who struggled to comprehend advanced English curriculum, forcing faculties to simplify grading standards and dilute academic rigor to avoid systemic failure rates. This process structurally downgraded the premium product that families in the Gulf had spent generations paying for, all to survive the fiscal quarter. Then, the political machinery in London intervened, turning a structural crisis into a terminal tailspin. Under intense domestic pressure to lower net migration figures, the British government enacted a series of aggressive policy interventions. The January 2024 ban on international student dependence had already eliminated a massive tier of postgraduate applicants. In May 2025, the Home Office published its immigration white paper, striking a decisive blow by reducing the post-study graduate visa from 24 months down to 18 months, while introducing a punitive tuition fee levy on international student income. The policy achieved its bureaucratic target. International student enrollment plummeted by an unprecedented 6% across the sector, with some mid-tier universities experiencing a 30% collapse in foreign applications. By trying to fix a migration crisis, the state had inadvertently defunded its own knowledge economy. This revenue collapse immediately triggered a physical and infrastructural breakdown. Universities are capital-heavy entities bound by massive construction debts and historic estate maintenance costs. By the winter of 2025, the sector entered an era of aggressive, desperate austerity. Specialized laboratories faced immediate funding freezes. The sector slated modern languages, chemistry, and physics departments across 30 institutions for complete termination. Staff-to-student ratios inverted, ballooning from an elite 1:12 ratio to an unmanageable 1:35 in core disciplines. The physical infrastructure began to degrade alongside the academic quality. Capital projects stood abandoned, half-built across northern England, while major research institutions deferred critical maintenance on Tier 1 computing clusters and biological containment facilities. As the economic foundations fractured, the regulatory and ideological framework of the institutions suffered a total systemic jam. In August 2025, the British government partially reinstated the Higher Education Free Speech Act, an over-engineered piece of legislation designed to protect controversial academic discourse. This statutory mandate placed university vice-chancellors in an impossible legal vice. On one side, the free speech regulator threatened institutions with severe financial penalties if they cancelled controversial speakers or penalised radical student societies. On the other side, the Office for Students and the Home Office demanded strict compliance with the Prevent Anti-Radicalisation framework, requiring universities to suppress the very extremist rhetoric that the Free Speech Act now legally shielded. Contradictory state directives completely paralysed the administration. This dual pressure point created an acute institutional schizophrenia. Radical student factions, emboldened by the legislative paralysis, escalated campus polarisation, hosting rallies and establishing permanent occupations that openly challenged the university's legal authority. Concurrently, the 75% increase in Islamist-linked prevent cases documented by the regulator forced security personnel to turn campuses into heavily monitored, securitized zones. An aggressive, heavily policed environment of ideological warfare replaced the prestige of the British campus, traditionally defined by quiet, intellectually rigorous debate within historic cloisters. For the security analysts in Abu Dhabi observing this internal friction, the data confirmed their darkest assessments. British universities had lost the structural capacity to police their own environments. In a final, paradoxical attempt to salvage their business models, British universities accelerated an inversion of their geographical footprints. If international students could no longer safely or legally study on British soil, the universities would transport the brand to them. Institutions like the University of Manchester and Heriot-Watt aggressively expanded their physical branch campuses within the tax-free zones of Dubai and Abu Dhabi. They sold the exact same British degrees, but under the total regulatory oversight and security surveillance of the Emirati state. This spatial pivot exposed a profound systemic irony. The classic Western university model could now only survive financially by operating within the strict controlled political environment of a Gulf autocracy. By early 2026, the entire architecture crossed the threshold of structural insolvency. Credit agencies quietly downgraded the ratings of 5 major UK university networks to near junk status, restricting their ability to borrow short-term capital to meet payroll obligations. The system has run out of alternative revenue streams, lowered its standards to the absolute floor, and alienated its most lucrative international partners. The system has passed the point of no return. The machinery is still spinning, but the internal gears have ground themselves to dust. By the summer of 2026, the physical topography of British higher education reflects a permanent geopolitical contraction. The prestigious pipeline that once transported the future leadership of the Arab world into the lecture halls of London, Oxford, and Cambridge has completely emptied. In its place stands an acute financial and structural vacancy. The multi-billion-pound deficit left by the Emirati withdrawal, compounded by the broader international flight, has forced the British government to confront a systemic choice it had spent 2 decades avoiding, execute, and unprecedented. Taxpayer-funded state bailout of historic universities, or allow core institutions of British soft power to default on their sovereign debts. The immediate economic data reveals the scale of this insolvency. Throughout the first half of 2026, 12 mid-tier English universities entered debt restructuring protocols, while 3 historic institutions initiated emergency merger talks to consolidate their remaining capital assets. The higher education sector has shed over 15,000 academic and administrative positions in a desperate attempt to stabilize cash reserves. The loss of the premium Gulf market did not just erase tuition fees, it collapsed the auxiliary economies of the university towns. High-end property developments in London, designed specifically for affluent international scholars, report historic vacancy rates, while private student housing providers face immediate credit downgrades as their underlying revenue models disintegrate. Geopolitically, the vacuum has triggered an immediate rerouting of global elite networks. Nature abhors a financial and institutional void. As the UAE Ministry of Higher Education enforced its strict blacklist, competing global economies intercepted the displaced capital and influence. Throughout 2026, elite universities in Paris, Washington, Canberra, and Singapore recorded a combined 40% surge in high-net-worth applications from the Middle East. The strategic leverage that Britain secured over 50 years through shared lecture halls and personal connections has evaporated within months. The future ministers, ambassadors, and security chiefs of the Gulf are no longer learning to view the world through a British institutional lens. They are building their intellectual and political alliances in capitals that draw a firm regulatory line against ideological extremism. The political response from London has been characterized by acute, delayed paralysis. In early 2026, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office established an emergency diplomatic task force to negotiate a bilateral compromise with Abu Dhabi. British diplomats presented a series of confidential proposals offering to grant specific, historic universities a security exemption by allowing UAE intelligence assets direct, unhindered oversight of student societies and campus security registries. Abu Dhabi flatly rejected the concession. For the Emirati state, the problem is not a lack of surveillance data. The problem is the fundamental structural permissiveness of the British legal architecture itself. A state cannot negotiate a security guarantee using institutions that are legally compelled by their own domestic laws to shield radical rhetoric under the guise of academic freedom. The domestic cost of this failure lands squarely on the British citizen and the domestic student. To offset the loss of foreign capital, universities have systematically restructured their internal models, converting themselves into low-cost vocational factories. Laboratory-based research, which requires immense capital subsidies derived from international tuition profits, has stalled across every major discipline. In 2026, the UK dropped out of the top 5 global rankings for scientific research output in biotechnology and advanced computing. Domestic undergraduates now pay identical tuition fees for a drastically downgraded product. Massive pre-recorded online lectures, depleted library archives, and zero access to specialized faculty. The strategy of using international capital to fund domestic infrastructure has inverted, leaving the domestic infrastructure completely defunded. Beyond the English Channel, the British collapse has accelerated a wider European contagion. The UK is no longer viewed as an academic leader, but as a biological hazard case study in institutional decay. Throughout 2026, the interior ministries of France, Germany, and Austria utilized the British regulatory failure to justify aggressive, sweeping state interventions within their own domestic university systems. The French government enacted strict secularism protocols that allow state security services to dissolve student organizations and remove academic tenure without judicial review if an individual expresses alignment with political Islam. The European academic landscape is fracturing into two distinct zones: states that deploy aggressive sovereign power to police their campuses, and Great Britain, which remains legally trapped within its own legacy definitions of unrestricted tolerance. This institutional hollowing has produced a final, dangerous paradox. The removal of moderate, affluent international students did not neutralize the radical elements on campus. It consolidated their influence. With the stabilizing, secularizing presence of the international business and administrative elite gone, the ideological fringes face no internal cultural counterweight within the student body. The university administration, crippled by financial anxiety and legal contradictions, lacks the material resources and institutional will to enforce security protocols. The campus has ceased to function as an engine of elite soft power and has transformed into a pure security liability, a space where ideological radicalism incubates inside an economic vacuum. The damage inflicted upon the system is structurally irreversible. You cannot rebuild 50 years of institutional trust with an administrative memo or a sudden change in visa policy. Reputation is a highly fragile economic asset. Once an allied state formalizes the assessment that a partner's institutions are an active vector of national security contagion, the calculation becomes systemic. The image of the Sandhurst, trained president, turning his back on the historic universities of the West, remains the definitive monument to the collapse of British institutional prestige. The machinery of Western soft power is not experiencing a temporary cyclical downturn. It has run into the hard reality of its own internal contradictions, and the floor has completely given way.